Welcome to The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm Jordan, and today I'm joined by a professor of philosophy at Samford University, Dr. Taylor Cyr. Hello, Dr. Cyr.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
I'm so excited to have you on today because we're going to be looking at the topic of free will. This is going to be a pretty basic introduction. What is free will? Why does it matter? What are the three main views of free will and more? So we're going to dive right in. First, let me ask you, Dr. Cyr, what is free will?
Well, there are lots of different uses of the term free will. Some people, if you ask 10 people what they think free will is, you'll get 10 different answers probably. But a lot of people think of it as connected with our choices, like the ability to make a choice, or perhaps the ability to make one choice and also at that very same time to make some other choice instead. We'll get into the details a little bit more in a minute. But it's pretty standard nowadays to use the term free will to pick out whatever type of control over our behavior would be required for us to be morally responsible for our behavior. So to be morally responsible is to be maybe praiseworthy or blameworthy for something that you do, such that it would, be fair and make sense for someone to hold you accountable for what you did. To have free will is to have whatever kind of control is required for that to make sense, for you to be morally responsible for what you do. And so that's how I like to use the term, following kind of standard usage nowadays.
So that is connected very much with moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's right.
So why does free will matter?
Yeah, here there are lots of different possible answers too, all of which are disputable. But some people think, you can't genuinely love someone if you don't have free will. Right? Maybe it wouldn't make sense for there to be an unfree robot that genuinely, loved someone or something like that. So maybe creativity requires free will. Perhaps autonomy requires free will. So there's lots of things that most people care about. Such as love, maybe genuine relationships, friendships, that sort of thing. And all of those, or at least some of them, seem to require free will. Setting those aside, though, given how I defined free will as connected with moral responsibility, it's very clear that free will matters for whether we're morally responsible. And a lot of us take ourselves to be morally responsible. Anytime that you feel a sense of pride in something you've done, or maybe guilt for having done something wrong, or anytime that you resent someone or express gratitude towards someone, it seems like you're presupposing that they had free will, that they're morally responsible for what they do. And so if you subtract that from our ways of relating to each other, I think you'd take away something important to us. And so it seems to matter whether we have free will. And certainly for typical Christians, part of the Christian framework is this idea that there's such a thing as sin, and sin, at least on most conceptions of it, is blameworthy wrongdoing, and that seems to presuppose moral responsibility too. So I think it matters for traditional understanding of sin.
A topic that I've spent a lot of time on my channel exploring is metaethics, especially when it comes to like a theistic, how theism connects with metaethics. And I've done a few videos with Eric Sampson where we look at nihilism. I'm just curious, based on this connection between free will and moral responsibility, have you seen any type of trend where philosophers that tend to be moral nihilists reject free will as well?
That might be. I don't know enough about the sort of sociology of the profession to make an educated guess, but I do think there are lots of people who are skeptical about free will, maybe even deny that we have free will, and who nevertheless think that there are moral facts. So that position is a possibility. But yeah, I would guess that among nihilists about moral facts, that it seems hard to make sense of how people could be free and responsible if they can't do it. There's no such thing as wrongdoing, or there's no facts about, immoral behavior.
Yeah. Okay. That was just off the top of my head, but I was curious.
That was a good question.
So what are some classic threats to free will?
There are lots of potential threats to free will, but maybe three are worth mentioning. One, and this goes back thousands of years in the Western philosophical tradition, one has to do with past truths about our behavior. So suppose that, I raise my hand right now. Seems like it was true 1,000 years ago that I would raise my hand then at that time, right? It was true 1,000 years before that I would do that 1,000 years after. If there are past truths like that about future behavior, contingent behavior, it seems to call into question how we could have done otherwise at the very least, and maybe how we could have had any control over what we did. So this is sometimes called fatalism, although that term gets used in a lot of different ways. But future contingents or the threat from past truths, this is one kind of potential threat to free will. I think it's widely regarded to be not that much of a threat to free will. There are persuasive responses to that threat. The next two that I'll mention get a lot more attention. They seem like bigger threats to free will. So the second is divine foreknowledge. And Jordan, we've talked quite a bit about divine foreknowledge in a couple of earlier interviews that we did. The first one just kind of laid out the problem of divine foreknowledge and free will. So for anyone interested in, why would God knowing something about what I'll do, why would that pose a threat to my freedom? Check out that video. And Jordan, you said you could put a link.
Yeah, if you'll point to it.
Right here.
Right there.
If you want to click there, you can go and watch that video and we'll lay out the problem in some detail. The third, and this is what we'll organize our conversation in the next few minutes, is the threat from causal determinism. And here the worry is that if the laws of nature, perhaps the laws of physics, perhaps a broader category, the laws of nature, are deterministic, what that would mean is, given the way the world was 1,000 years ago, given the way the world was at any time in the past, maybe the very distant past, there was only one way that the future could unfold from that point, given the laws of nature. So think of maybe this is helpful, maybe it's not, but think of the laws of nature as like a function, and think of the way the world was, say, 1,000,000 years ago, the state of the whole universe at that time. Think of that as like an input to the function, the laws of nature, right? If you think about it that way, maybe that's not totally helpful, but what you'd get is an output about what the state of the world would be like at the very next moment that you could then use as an input into the very same function, the laws of nature, which would tell you, it would give you another output, what the world would be like at the next time. And if you keep applying that function, you could get a unique future kind of completely described, and there's only one way that it could be at each time. And so for causal determinism to be true, it means that there's only one physically possible future from any point in time, given deterministic laws.
Yeah.
So there are other threats, like more recently, developments in neuroscience and in psychology have raised sort of new challenges to free will. But the classic problem, maybe it's the problem of free will, if we want to call any problem the problem of free will, it's the problem of free will and determinism.
Very good. So past truths, divine foreknowledge, and even just classic determinism, this kind of input-output with the laws of nature. Those are some of the threats. And we mentioned a couple of videos for those interested. Definitely check out the interview with Taylor on Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom. And you may be interested as well in checking out my interview with Dr. John Martin Fischer, where I think he develops, if I remember correctly from that interview, some things that are compatible with determinism, but it's really interesting. So maybe check out those interviews. Okay, so I mentioned the word a couple of times now. What exactly is causal determinism?
Yeah, I gave a brief sketch a minute ago in terms of, I used the example of a function, the laws of nature as a function, the state of the universe as a sort of input. Yeah, but the idea is that given the way the world is at any time, there's only one way that the world can sort of develop from there. So only one physically possible future. And so what that means is, any choice that you make, any overt action you perform, like my raising my hand, there are truths, facts about those actions that were entailed by facts about the state of the world in the distant past and the laws of nature. And for a lot of people, that seems to call into question free will. In fact, some people will say the problem of free will is the problem of free will versus determinism, because how could free will and determinism kind of go together? They seem out of whack. So anyway, I would caution people not to portray the problem of free will as free will versus determinism, because as we'll see, many people think there isn't really a tension between free will and determinism. But it at least seems like a potential threat to freedom.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about this question? Is determinism true?
Right. This is a good question. And at various points in history, people were more inclined to say yes. Maybe even, of course, determinism is true. Maybe this is the best way to think of Newtonian physics. Maybe this is the best way to think about the universe as a kind of mechanism. So for a while, a lot of people thought yes, and especially in the early modern period and up to the early 20th century, probably most philosophers and scientists were determinists. And so, yeah, if you thought that free will and determinism were incompatible with each other, that seems like a big problem for free will. But nowadays, the view that determinism is true is very much a minority position, right? With the rise of quantum physics, lots of people, lots of physicists think the best interpretation of the science is indeterministic. And if that's the case, well, then we shouldn't affirm determinism or suppose that the universe is deterministic. So you might think, well, if there's no worry about determinism being true, why even raise the problem of free will and determinism? But I think you can learn a lot about free will, what we think is involved in being morally responsible for what we do, if you ask questions about free will and determinism, setting aside the question of whether determinism is true. Like in particular, the nature of free will is what's at issue in the free will debate, what it is to have freedom, to be morally responsible for what we do. And whether you think it's compatible or incompatible with determinism will tell you a lot about what you think free will is. So that's why, even though probably most philosophers, if you ask them, would say, I don't know whether determinism is true or not, or maybe they even say, I'm pretty sure it isn't, they still think it's important to talk about free will and determinism.
Yeah. So whatever that freedom is that's required for moral responsibility, you can get a better grasp of what that type of freedom is by reflecting on what would need to be the case, even if determinism is true, regardless if it's true or not. If it was, what would need to be there for you to have the freedom necessary for moral responsibility?
Right. Yeah, good.
Okay. Well, is free will compatible with determinism?
This leads us to the big debate. maybe this is the problem of free will. Is free will compatible with determinism? And a lot of people think yes, but there are some good reasons to think no. And so I'll just sketch maybe the master argument for incompatibilism, for the thesis that free will and determinism are incompatible with each other. Sometimes this is called the consequence argument. The basic idea is this: given what I just said about determinism, if determinism is true, then our behavior is the inevitable consequence of the way the world was in the distant past, together with the laws of nature. And since what the world was like in the distant past and what the laws of nature are, those are not up to me in any sense. It seems like the inevitable consequences of those things, right, including my behavior, isn't up to me either. So if determinism is true, then my behavior is not really up to me in the way that I might ordinarily suppose. And so I don't have free will. I'm not really morally responsible for what we do, for what I do. All right. So yeah, the idea is, so determinism means there's only one way that the world could develop, holding fixed the way it was in the past, together with the laws of nature. And look, if things that are outside of my control, like the state of the world a million years ago and what the laws of nature are, neither of those things are up to me. Even if I had a time machine, you might think it's not really up to me what the world was like a million years ago. But anyway, if those things aren't up to me and they necessitate what I do, well, then it seems like what I do isn't really up to me either. So this is, as I said, sometimes called the consequence argument, because it seems like if determinism is true, my behavior is just the inevitable consequence of things outside of my control. So one wrinkle worth mentioning before we get into the different positions in the free will debate is that one way out of this argument is to say, well, this argument is about, I use the locution up to me, like it being up to me what I do, or my behaviors being up to me. You might think what that picks out is what we might call a leeway conception of freedom, where to have leeway is to be able to do one thing and also to be able to do something else at that very same time. Sometimes you hear other expressions used to refer to this conception of freedom, like alternative possibilities or the freedom or ability to do otherwise. It does seem like this argument calls into question whether the ability to do otherwise is compatible with determinism, because it seems to suggest that given things that are outside of your control, there's only one way that you could act at any given time. So it's not up to you whether you do something else instead. So I'll kind of put some of my cards on the table. I am a compatibilist about free will and determinism, but I actually think this is a very good argument against a leeway conception of freedom being compatible with determinism. So what's the alternative, no pun intended, to a leeway conception of freedom? Well, sometimes people use the language of sourcehood as a way of contrasting with leeway. So a source conception of freedom says what matters for having free will is not being able to do otherwise or having leeway. It's just being the appropriate source of your behavior, so that it's really up to you in this other sense. It traces to you in some relevant sense. And that might not require that you have alternative possibilities or leeway. So this gets into issues about what's sometimes called the principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP or PAP for short, which says that to be morally responsible, to be free in the sense required for moral responsibility, a person has to have been able to do otherwise, had to have had alternative possibilities. If you accept the sourcehood conception of freedom, you might be okay with denying PAP and saying, no, you can actually be morally responsible even if you lacked alternative possibilities. So you mentioned that interview you did with John Martin Fischer. He's a very big proponent of the source conception of freedom, and he denies PAP. So that's one way to go to kind of avoid this big challenge to free will's compatibility with determinism. And it's a way that I think is very promising.
Yeah. Okay. So that type of the consequence argument, and I believe Peter Van Inwagen advances this, correct?
Yeah, he does. Yeah, is
a good argument against leeway freedom, where you have alternative possibilities, but it doesn't seem to target this sourcehood version. So you would need an argument probably to show that the sourcehood version ends up not meeting the kind of requirements that we think need to be met for the type of freedom we're talking about with respect to moral responsibility. Okay, yeah. So this leads us to the final question. So what are the three main positions in the free will determinism debate?
Yeah, great. So this is oversimplifying just a tiny bit, but you can think of the three main positions as being compatibilist, and then libertarian, and then finally skepticism about free will. So the main distinction is between compatibilists and incompatibilists. But among incompatibilists, you have some who think we do have free will, and they're called libertarians. And then you have some that think, no, we don't have free will, and we'll just call them free will skeptics. So I'll start with compatibilists, as the name suggests, and I've kind of already indicated this. Compatibilists take free will and determinism to be compatible with each other. So, whatever free will is, determinism doesn't preclude it. Now, one common mistake in thinking about the free will debate is to suppose that, or assume that, compatibilists affirm determinism. Back in the day when a lot more people thought determinism was true, but before the rise of quantum physics, people just used the language of determinist and indeterminist. But nowadays, people don't really identify as determinists or not. But back then, compatibilists were often called soft determinists because they affirmed determinism, but thought that didn't, rule out freedom. Hard determinists, by contrast, were those determinists who were incompatibilists. They thought determinism is true and it takes away free will. But you know, the compatibilists were the softer sort of determinists who thought, no, we still have free will and moral responsibility. So anyway, that terminology has fallen out of favor. So now compatibilists, better terminology. Most compatibilists think we have free will and we have it whether or not determinism is true. And I fall into this camp, but prominent compatibilists from the history of philosophy and from recent history include Thomas Hobbes, David Hume. They're sort of classical compatibilists. More recently, David Lewis, Daniel Dennett, Lynn Baker, John Martin Fischer, who we mentioned, Carolina Sartorio. These are some of the big names in philosophy defending forms of compatibilism. In theology, in the Christian tradition, going back before the Reformation, it's a little bit tricky to pin down whether people were compatibilists or libertarians, but some people interpret St. Augustine as a compatibilist. Others interpret him as a libertarian, so that's a little tricky. Same with St. Thomas Aquinas. Some of what he says makes him sound like a compatibilist, but other people interpret him as a libertarian. So it's a little tricky. When you get to the Reformation, it's pretty clear that John Calvin and certain other reformers, Jonathan Edwards, who wrote on free will, certainly they are definitely compatibilists. So many Calvinists and other in the Reformed tradition would be compatibilists. Recently, Paul Helm is a big name in theology who defends a compatibilist position. Now, one potential challenge, and then I'll move on to the next type of view for compatibilists, besides the consequence argument, and I already mentioned one way of trying to get around that by adopting a source model instead of the leeway model of freedom. But a potential challenge that's gotten a lot of discussion in the last 20 years or so is what's called the manipulation argument. And the basic idea is determinism, according to this argument, rules out freedom because it's not relevantly different from this other thing that rules out freedom and responsibility, namely manipulation. So if you imagine that someone kind of was covertly brainwashed into desiring to do some bad action, and then they wake up and they go do that bad action because of this manipulation, it seems like they're not blameworthy for the bad thing, right? If it was a result of manipulation. But some people argue being causally determined by factors beyond your control, like the state of the world in the distant past, together with the laws of nature, right? That is relevantly similar to the kind of manipulation that we all take to undermine freedom and responsibility. So I could go into that in a lot more detail. A lot of my research is focused on this manipulation argument, but I'll just leave it as that's maybe the potential, or maybe the biggest potential threat to compatibilist views of freedom and responsibility. And it's a lively discussion right now in philosophy.
Great. I'm eager to hear more about that. So before you mention the next two, I want to mention a couple things. One, if you're liking this video, hit the like button, consider subscribing. But two, and I'll mention this at the end as well, Taylor has an amazing show called The Free Will Show. It's a podcast and it's a YouTube channel. You should go listen to that. He brings on top-notch guests in this area of philosophy, has great content, so you should really go check that out. Okay, we laid out one of the positions, but we said there are three. So what's the next one?
The next one is libertarianism, and this is incompatibilism. Free will and determinism are incompatible with each other, plus the thesis that we have free will, or that ordinary human beings have free will. So incompatibilism plus the pro-free will thesis. So it's worth noting libertarians are committed to the falsity of determinism because they think determinism would take away free will and we have it. So they are committed to an empirical claim about the natural world, which is interesting, worth noting. But libertarians aren't necessarily committed to what's sometimes called a contra-causal freedom, or even to the existence of immaterial souls, things that are sort of separate from the natural causal order. Right? It is common to think if we have free will and determinism would take it away, well, then we must have some kind of powers outside of the ordinary causal chain. And some libertarians do think that free will requires that our actions, or at least maybe our decisions, are uncaused. There's no causal explanation for them whatsoever. But the majority of libertarians accept causal accounts of free will and free action and think that what matters is that our choices and our actions aren't sufficiently caused. They're not deterministically caused. And that leaves room for a kind of indeterministic or probabilistic causation. So the idea is take some concrete case, take the example of me raising my hand. If this is an example of a free action, then according to the libertarian, that couldn't have been causally determined by prior factors, right? Including factors, you know, in my head, like my reasons for using that as an example, my desire to use that example, that sort of thing. That wasn't sufficient for my raising of my hand if that was a free action. But that's not to say that there was no causal explanation of my hand raising, right? You can still trace it back to my beliefs and desires, maybe other things. So all that to say, you know, at first, some people, when they hear about libertarian free will, they think that's contrary to science, or it's incoherent. There's something confused about the very idea of indeterministic action or freedom. But there's nothing incoherent in that, at least so far, in that description of the view. Maybe it's worth mentioning.
Prominent libertarians.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's worth mentioning. So some people think that the ancient Epicureans, like Epicurus himself, maybe Democritus before him, were proto-libertarians. Right? The labels don't go back that far, of course, but more recently, in the Christian tradition, you have people like Molina, after whom Molinism's named. Very famous Christian philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, Peter Van Inwagen, Eleanor Stump. They are all libertarians. William Lane Craig, too, who's also been on your channel, is a libertarian. Yeah, I think that's a good sampling. It's probably the majority view among Christian philosophers. And as I said, you know, it's tricky going back to people like St. Augustine and even in the medieval period with St. Thomas Aquinas and others. But many contemporary Christian philosophers interpret those doctors of the church as libertarian, although I think that's up for debate.
Yeah. Okay, so that was libertarianism. Yeah. This final position you call skepticism. So what's it about?
So the skeptic says, well, there's lots of options for how to be a skeptic about free will, but let's just call it the no free will position. Maybe we could call it free will nihilism, although it's more common to use the term skepticism, which is just to say that we don't have free will. It might be because the skeptic thinks free will is impossible. And so it really doesn't have anything to do with determinism or indeterminism. Those are sometimes called free will impossibilists. You know, philosophers are very clever with their names sometimes. Probably most skeptics about free will, at least people who work on the subject who are skeptics about free will, do think that determinism rules out free will for interesting reasons. And so they really count as incompatibilists. But also they think that indeterminism, even indeterminism in just the way that libertarians think gives us free will, indeterminism, according to the skeptic, doesn't really help. It's no gain to freedom. It's yeah, we don't have free will either way, whether determinism or indeterminism is true. So skeptics deny that we have free will. Now, since I mentioned some of the earlier terminology a minute ago, it used to be that many free will skeptics were hard determinists. They thought determinism is true and it rules out freedom. But nowadays, I don't know of any hard determinists because most people don't want to be determinists. So most skeptics are what we might call hard incompatibilists. They think incompatibilism is true and libertarianism is false. So we don't have free will. Prominent proponents of this view include Dirk Pereboom, Galen Strawson, Greg Caruso, probably several others. It's a less popular option among Christians. I mentioned earlier the conception of sin as involving, blameworthy conduct. If you give up this view that we're morally responsible for what we do in that sense, it seems like you have to have a revisionary account of sin. And more generally, this, I think, is a big challenge for skepticism, even apart from Christian commitments. It does seem that a lot of our interpersonal relationships presuppose that we are free and responsible. Like even when I just praise someone for doing something good, I express gratitude towards them. It seems like I'm saying, hey, that was up to you. You did it. And that was really great that you did it. You deserve some praise for it. But if we have to give up this view of ourselves as morally responsible agents, well, it'll affect a lot of how we think of each other and the nature of our relationships, I think. So that's one challenge. And I should mention one reason for being a hard incompatibilist, this form of a skeptic, is there's already a lot of challenges for compatibilists. We've seen the consequence argument, worries about manipulation, but there's a big problem for libertarianism, kind of skipped over, which is sometimes called the problem of luck, which calls into question whether an undetermined action can really be free, right? If something else could have happened at that very time, holding fixed everything that came before it, right up to that very moment, it seems more like a matter of luck or chance that the thing occurred than that it was under anyone's control. So even libertarians like Peter Van Imwagen are really worried about this problem of luck. In fact, in Van Imwagen's case, he's so worried about it that he affirms a position that's called Mysterianism about free will, which is his version is a libertarian position because he's committed to libertarianism. He just is also committed to not knowing how free will works. It's a mystery, according to him. Yeah.
Well, this was really interesting, and I'm thinking it's a great starting point for people to get into the discussion, get into this topic. Now, the plan is to bring on 3 more guests. So this will be kind of a mini series that we do. And each one of them is going to be a proponent of one of the positions we just described. So we're going to bring on a compatibilist, a libertarian, and then a free will nihilist or skeptic. Nice. And be on the lookout for those videos. Before we end this, do you want to say anything in conclusion, Taylor?
Well, since you mentioned the podcast, The Free Will Show, earlier, I'll take a second to plug that one more time. For anyone interested in any of the issues and arguments that came up in this brief introduction to free will, there's probably a whole episode of this podcast, The Free Will Show, dedicated to that topic. So there's one on the consequence argument, there's one on the problem of luck, there's one on manipulation arguments. So I would recommend that people check that out if they're interested. I started the podcast with my friend Matt Flummer, who's also a philosopher that works on free will, mostly just so that we could chat with other philosophers about free will. So most of the episodes are interviews, and they're all about 45 minutes. And the first season, first 10 episodes, just introduce basic issues and arguments in this debate, including a lot of the topics that came up in this video. And then we've released a second season, which focuses on free will and determinism. And each episode is about a different position in the debate. So we go a little bit more fine-grained than I did in this video. So if you're interested in like different types of libertarian or compatibilist positions, there will be several episodes on each of those. So you should check that out. It's called The Free Will Show. You can get it on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. The
link to his podcast and YouTube channel are in the description of this video. So you can check it out right now, and be sure to come back to this playlist and look at the other interviews. Thank you very much, Dr. Cyr, for joining me. I had a blast and learned a lot from you.
Thanks, Jordan.
All right. We'll see you next time.